Hi everyone, thank you for watching this presentation on climate justice that myself and my colleague Alex will deliver for you. My name's Africa. It's obviously a real shame not to be able to deliver this in person to you. We were really looking forward to the event, which is an exciting and important way to bring young people and political organizations together. Young people like yourselves have a huge stake in the issue of climate change, which will be a part of your future. And it's so encouraging to see how engaged and passionate you all are about the issue. It's also worth saying that we have tried to record this together and for both of us to be on camera, but we are currently based in two different countries, so it's been quite a challenge. So this was our last resource, and I hope it does work as well for you. So just a little bit about us. We're both researchers on climate change, and we're both part of the Leverhulme Climate Justice Programme at the University of Reading. So our research was part of a bigger project at Reading, which aims to understand how we can respond to climate change in a just way. For example, whose voices should we listen to when we're thinking of policies for dealing with climate change, and what would be a fair division of the costs of these policies. So the talk today will be structured in three parts, and the overall aim of the presentation is to outline some of the main themes of our research and to try and help you see why climate change is a matter of justice and not just of science. So the first part, Alex will be talking about the principles of climate justice, and then in the second part, I will be giving you an example of climate injustice. And we will be looking at climate-related displacement from small island developing states. And then lastly, we'll leave you with some questions that we would like you to think about, and hopefully will trigger some interesting discussions amongst yourselves. And we'd be really keen to hear your thoughts, so we've put our emails in the last slide, and we'd love for you to send them to us.
So in this part of the presentation, I'd like to talk to you about the principles of climate justice. So these principles have received a great deal of attention in the academic literature. They've been the subject of much debate, but they've also been mentioned regularly. They're very popular in climate change activism. And indeed, they've even been mentioned and drawn upon in international climate change negotiations. So as a starting point, let's just remind ourselves of the obvious. The effects of climate change are very, very bad for those who experience them. People's homes are threatened by climate change in a number of ways. For example, by flooding, by extreme weather events, by wildfires. Societies will be increasingly unable to grow crops because of increased droughts, for example. Populations will become vulnerable to different diseases, which do better in high temperatures. So the effects of climate change, given how bad they are, presumably require us to prevent them. We must take action against climate change. So what sort of action should we take against climate change? So we can divide the kinds of actions we might take against climate change into two categories. So mitigation costs, roughly speaking, are those costs that people will incur when they take action to stop causing climate change. So the obvious example would be the costs that people incur when they reduce their emissions and transfer to renewable energy. A second kind of cost we can call adaptation costs, or are commonly called adaptation costs. So the idea here is that even with the first kind of cost, mitigation, we've still committed ourselves to a certain degree of climate change, and will need to take measures to prevent people from being harmed by those effects. So, for example, we will need to build seawalls, improve infrastructures, make them more resilient against storms. So we need to take measures to adapt to climate change. So yeah, I think it's really important to note at this point, when we're talking about climate change effects, it's sometimes tempting to think of those in the future, as primarily in the future. But we're increasingly understanding that climate change effects are making themselves felt now and are already causing significant harm. So a question that is raised here, a problem that needs addressing, is who ought to bear these costs? How should we divide the costs of climate change mitigation and adaptation between us? So in order to address this problem, philosophers and activists have developed a number of principles that they've suggested might tell us how we should divide the cost of climate change. They should specify a fair distribution of these costs. So the first principle is, I take it, a simple and familiar one. It's the principle of historical responsibility. So the principle of historical responsibility, the underlying idea is, if you've caused a problem, then you're responsible for resolving it. So in the case of climate change, the idea is the burdens of climate change policy should track historical emissions. So the states that have emitted most heavily in the past are most responsible for climate change burdens. So the thought here should be relatively familiar. You may have heard it at home. If you've broken it, you should fix it. You should clean up your own mess. So some people have objected to historical responsibility. They've said, for example, that lots of people who are currently alive haven't been alive for all that long. So, for example, we might think people of your age who are at school aren't actually responsible for a large amount of historical emissions. Historical emissions go back to early industrialization. And so it seems strange, according to this objection, to say that present states should be held responsible for their historical emissions, given that lots of their citizens haven't been alive for very long. So that's the first kind of worry we might have about this principle. Another worry is that people up until sometime in the 20th century weren't aware of climate change. So we can debate about exactly when people did become aware of climate change. But let's say before 1970, we didn't know at all about climate change. So then the objection says it's unfair to hold people responsible for emissions before this point because they didn't know that they were doing anything wrong. So those are some worries we might have about the principle of historical responsibility. So an alternative principle that has been suggested, again, should be quite simple and probably familiar. It basically says that the richest states globally should bear the cost of climate change. So they should do so because they're most able to pay. Because they're rich, they're most able to bear the costs. This is known as the ability to pay principle. So this principle has attracted lots of admirers, but again, it's been criticised for various reasons. So some people just find it odd and unacceptable to ignore historical emissions entirely. It seems kind of weird, they say, to ignore the historical source of the problem. Surely historical emissions must be relevant. And so then we come to a third principle that people have suggested to try and fill this gap. So this is the beneficiary pays principle, which I think is possibly less familiar, but has been very, very prominent in these debates about climate change. So the beneficiary pays principle says historical emissions are relevant, but they're not relevant necessarily because people current citizens are responsible for them. They're relevant instead because current citizens are benefiting from those emissions. They're benefiting from those emissions through the infrastructure they live in, the economies they exist in, have all been developed on the basis of fossil fuel-based industrial development. And so because these people are benefiting, so says the beneficiary pays principle, they should bear the majority of the costs of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So those are the three kind of main principles of climate justice. The principle of historical responsibility, you've broken it, you should fix it. The ability to pay principle, you should pay for climate change because you're most able to, because you're rich. Or the beneficiary pays principle, which says you should bear the cost of climate change because you've benefited most from historical emissions. So I think the principles of climate justice that I discussed on the previous slide are really important. And it's interesting to debate about which of them has the most force and should play the dominant role in distributing climate change burdens. But I wanted to say two things about these principles of climate justice and about climate justice more broadly before ending this section. So the first thing is I think it's really important to note that all of these principles are in rough agreement about the sorts of agents who should pay. That is the principle of historical responsibility, the ability to pay principle, and the beneficiary pays principle all point at the same kinds of states when thinking about who should bear climate change burdens. So in particular, they all point to rich industrial states. So take the United Kingdom, for example. The United Kingdom has a high level of historical emissions, relatively speaking, has a high level of ability to pay because it's quite a rich state, and many of its current citizens have benefited from historical emissions, and they've benefited because they live in this developed industrial economy. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, that on any of these principles, countries like the UK should be bearing considerable climate change burdens. They have considerable responsibility for mitigating and adapting to climate change. So the second thing that I wanted to say was about progress with climate justice today. So unfortunately, the reality is states have not met their ambitions. They haven't taken anything like the necessary mitigation and adaptation measures, and so the gap between climate justice and reality is very significant. And so I can only hope that the current wave of youth activism might galvanise climate justice, might help bridge the gap between climate justice and reality.
So now we move on to talk about climate-related displacement as an example of climate injustice, and for you to see why the questions and principles that Alex has raised and developed are of such significant importance. And also to do something else, which is to approach climate justice by empathizing with affected populations and engaging with the personal, emotional and subjective aspects of justice and fairness. So my own research focuses on climate-related displacement, and this means that individuals, families, and sometimes entire communities and countries might have to leave their homes behind because the effects of climate change have become so bad that they're no longer habitable. So as part of my PhD, I spent some time in the Maldives researching this, and so it is this case study that I will share with you today. So just a little bit of background information on the Maldives, which is a small island, developing state in the Indian Ocean, and many of you might have heard about it. And there are 1,200 islands, out of which 200 are inhabited. And the scientific predictions suggest that it is only a matter of time until the islands will be gone with the waves. It's not certain, of course, because we can't know 100%, but it is likely, and so we need to think about this from a justice perspective. And today I want to share 3 key messages from my time out there that summarize what islanders were thinking about and were worried about in relation to this topic. The first message is that they really thought about displacement as a matter of fairness and justice. They insisted that it was not them who had acted in a way leading to these consequences, and they expressed the disparity between developing and developed countries in contributing to climate change and the way in which the impacts would be felt disproportionately. So here are 2 quotes that some participants shared. The first one reads, "I think it's really unfair. The developed areas already with a lot of money and resources, they don't think about the impacts of climate change to the SIDS," and SIDS here refers to small island developing states, "and they still keep on seemingly doing whatever they can to get more money, more developed areas, and they just can't seem to understand the situation that we could be put into." And the second quote reads, "The thought of climate change and its impacts have always been disturbing. The aftermath of it has always been something which runs through my mind every day. In the worst case scenario, us being forced to move out of our beautiful homes because of some of the power-hungry countries kept using the Earth's resources more for the so-called development has always made me angry as well as sad." A second message that I want to share with you today is that islanders were very clear in their desire and intention to continue to call their islands home. They really did not want to move, nor to be displaced, and the prospect of moving to another country was really overwhelming for them. And you will see throughout these quotes and the ones that come next that the justice concerns run through them. So here the quotes say, "We were born here, we have grown up here, so we don't want to move somewhere else. This is our island. We belong to this nation and would not want to migrate for any reason." And lastly, There is this unsettling fear that one day we might have to leave our home behind and migrate to another foreign land. Personally, I do not have the heart to do it, to leave my home behind. All because the developed and developing countries need more convenient lives. By trying to develop their homes and future, the lives of islanders and their futures are on the stake. People need to change. Climate change is a threat to us, and we need the world to understand. So you can see here the elements of justice and inequality that are coming through for these people. And the last thing, the last message that I want to share with you is Islanders' response when I asked them about what they feared losing in the context of climate-related migration. So it might be fairly obvious to assume that they would lose their current ways of living and their environment, and to a certain extent we could also assume that their futures would be lost, in the sense that as we currently imagine our own futures, if the UK, for example, was to be affected by climate change and become uninhabitable, the future that you had imagined would no longer take place. So in that sense, it would be lost. But what was interesting is that Islanders insisted that it was not only the present and the future that would be lost, but also the past and their memories. So these quotes reflect this, and they say, "Each and every memory, my life in Maldives, everything will be missed. The peaceful life, friendly life, every single second of my life will be missed. Our lives will be missed, all of our hopes, our dreams, and everything will be gone." And a second quote that reads, "When I think about Maldives disappearing, what really affects me personally is the story of Maldives that is going to go. A story about hundreds of generations of people that came before you and the effort they made to build this community." So I would invite you to reread all these quotes in your own time and to really try to empathize with Islanders and see what it is that they're trying to say throughout. But just to reflect broadly, that if we're committed to responding to climate change in a just way, it will certainly require, on the one hand, that we take action to mitigate climate change and stop emitting, but on the other hand, it would also require braveness and creativity to respond to the threats and the issues that we now face in a context of a changing climate. And I want to encourage you and remind you that you can play a role in both of those necessities. So on the one hand, we must care about climate change and stop it in the ways that we can. But you can also use your skills and your abilities to think about these issues creatively. So for instance, if Islanders want to continue to live in the islands as opposed to migrate, perhaps there might be ways of creating floating islands or floating countries in a way that allows them to stay. And these will require engineers, architects, designers, and a lot of other skill sets and abilities. So it's just an encouragement for you to think beyond turning the tap off or walking instead of using a car. That there's a lot more to climate change, and there's a lot more to climate justice.
So we wanted to leave you with a few questions that have emerged from our presentation. So first of all, what principle is best suited for guiding the cost of climate change mitigation and adaptation? Second, what do you think you could do to promote climate justice at the local level? Third, how can you get involved in climate activism? Fourth, what are your favourite places and why are they important? Fifth, what do you think brings comfort or justice when we experience loss? And finally, what inspires you to take action on climate change?
You've enjoyed this presentation and that it has given you an insight into what climate justice is, and that you are now able to think about climate change beyond it being a scientific phenomenon. We hope you enjoy the questions as well and that you do think about them. And we'd be really, really keen to hear your responses and your thoughts on them, or any other reflections that you might have on what Alex and I have been speaking about today. So here are our emails. Feel free to send us an email with any thoughts. We'd be really, really excited to hear from you. So thanks very much again, and we hope it was enjoyable.